Um, the foundation of Ismaili theology, which is a form of Islamic theology, is Tawhid. But Tawhid is understood by Ismailis as it goes way further than saying there is one God as opposed to 2, 3, or 4 gods. Tawhid is understood to mean the radical transcendence and absolute oneness of God, to the point where God transcends all similarity with created being. Now, the implication of that is that for Ismailis, one cannot truly describe God by names like the living, the powerful, or the knowing, even though we tend to do that commonly, that the meanings of these words don't really capture God. And taken literally, they are invalid. It also means that for those who are into philosophy, God cannot be categorized as a cause or a substance or a thing or even as something that exists. Because existent and non-existent are still two binary categories. And the Ismailis would say God is not merely an existent among other things that exist. Because trees exist and dogs exist and plants exist. So if we say God exists, we're putting him in that same class. The Ismailis would say God is the one who brings existence into being. Right? So that's just an example. And what Ismailis would tend to do, and this is when I say Ismailis here, I'm talking about, theologically literate Ismailis, of course. Theology is not something for everybody. But in the Ismaili theological tradition, statements such as, God is knowing are interpreted to mean God originates all knowledge. It is not interpreted to mean there's something that God possesses that is knowledge, that is in addition to his essence, or there is something that God possesses called life, which is in addition to his essence. So that meaning is negated. So all these statements that we find in the Quran and in prayer are affirmed, but they are interpreted in a more sort of esoteric, philosophical way, so as to maintain the absolute oneness and transcendence of God. I'm making this point because among many Muslims today, there is sort of like the rumor, or there's the accusation that Ismailis commit shirk, or that Ismailis violate Tawhid. Why? Well, the reasoning goes, the Ismailis revere their Imam, and they call upon the Imam for help, which I'll talk about. And that is then used to say, therefore, they don't believe in Tawhid. Well, it's actually quite the opposite. From a theological perspective, the Ismaili discourse on Tawhid is some of the most thoroughgoing Muslim theology in all of Muslim history. It simply cannot be denied. It is a historical fact. But this type of Ismaili theology is rarely talked about today, because people just don't know about it. This is just a sample. I won't read it, but Nasiruddin Tusi, he was an Ismaili Dai and philosopher during the 13th century, and he sort of says it pretty well. He basically says God is beyond, all attributes and anything that can be spoken of, and he is beyond all this and beyond the beyond, and so forth. In other words, our language will fail. We can't really talk about God as he truly is. And there is this belief among Ismaili thinkers that God creates and sustains everything that exists through a creative act called the Word of God or the command of God, and that God's creation and maintenance of whatever exists is constant. So it is not that God created at some point in the past, but rather everything here right now that you see ongoingly depends on God to exist. And that belief is coupled with this other idea that God creates everything through a network of intermediaries. For example, you have God, then you have God's Word, which is God's creative act, which is an eternal act of causing things to be. And then there are further spiritual intermediaries called the universal intellect and the universal soul. And then you have the physical universe as we know it. This is a common with even people like Al-Ghazali in the Sunni tradition affirmed this idea of creation via intermediaries. The Sufis all believe in it. Many of the Islamic philosophers believe in this too. So it's actually not a very uncommon thing. And one of the recent Ismaili Imams, Aga Khan III, he expressed this belief by when he said, "The creation according to Islam is not a unique act in a given time, but a perpetual and constant event. God supports and sustains all existence at every moment by His will and His thought." So moving on then, we can also briefly touch on the Ismaili theory of revelation and imamology. So this is an interesting topic, and I can't really do it justice fully right now, but there's this general idea that God's first book or writing is the whole cosmos. Everything that exists. That's God's writing. And throughout God's writing, what we call the laws of nature, for example, that is divine guidance. So divine guidance is sort of being transmitted like all over existence by God, always. And at the human level, divine guidance is a type of knowledge that is only perceived by prophets and imams. And what happens generally is what the prophets and imams perceive of God's guidance, that is called divine inspiration, and it is non-verbal. So the prophets don't actually hear Arabic or Hebrew or anything like that. Their hearts and souls receive, you could say, pure knowledge from God. And what the prophets do is they translate that, or they encode that pure knowledge into a verbal discourse that's made up of language, signs, and symbols. That's also true for Prophet Muhammad. So in Ismaili theology, what we call the Quran is technically it is the divinely inspired composition of Prophet Muhammad, by which Prophet Muhammad articulated for his audience the revelatory knowledge that came to him from God. This differs from other ideas of the Quran which are more dominant among Muslims today, which say God literally spoke in Arabic and that was transmitted. Whereas the Ismailis would say God doesn't speak in Arabic. God's speech is without form. And it's actually the Prophet who coined it into Arabic. And if that's the case, it is also necessary to have a second figure, in addition to the Prophet, who is going to decode that revelatory message and explain its inner meaning. And that is the role of the Imams. So what the prophets do is called tanzil. They literally translate divine inspiration into a symbol-filled discourse, which we would call the Quran or the Torah or the Gospel or whatnot. And then the role of the Imams for everyone living in the prophet's time and afterward is to reveal the inner meaning of that discourse. So if we look at the role of the Imam today, we'll do questions at the end, yeah. If we look at the role of the Imam today, which is informed by a lot of this theology, what Aga Khan IV does today is quite vast, and I've tried to categorize it here. So there are a number of roles that the Ismaili Imam today does that are particular for the Ismaili community. And this is just a matter of what he empirically does. So he gives the Ismaili community guidance. Some of that guidance is specific for the community, and that is called a farman. Anytime the Imam meets with the community in a private setting, he will give them a farman. As part of that, the Imam will give blessings to his community. That's one of his principal roles. So the community of Ismailis, they see the Imam as an intermediary for God's blessings, and the Imam actually behaves in that way. He also interprets the religious practices of the community. So everything the Ismailis do today in terms of how they pray, how they fast, how they do dhikr, all of that has to be authorized by the Ismaili Imam. The community is not permitted to sort of just make up their own practices. Another thing he does is, well, what shall we talk about? There are so many things here. There's this idea of the Imam as the one who gives spiritual purification to his community. So people come to the Imam to get spiritually cleansed through a certain type of ritual. This, of course, is not unique to the Ismailis. Many Sufis go to their sheikhs, and Sufi sheikhs do similar things. So that's all within this top category. This is all within the community. And these ceremonies and rituals and this discourse is often private, and I'll talk about why in a bit. But then there are parts of the Aga Khan's Imamat that consist of roles that he does for the public. Because he does see his role as Imam to encompass more than the Ismailis. And that public role includes things like the Aga Khan Development Network that I talked about. It also includes numerous speeches and guidances that the Aga Khan has given, to public audiences. And at the same time, the Aga Khan is also a private individual who lives his own life. So he has certain businesses because, he has to also live and provide for his own family and his own relatives. So he has certain private businesses. He is very famous because he has a race breeding operation, which by the way, is a 150-year family tradition that Aga Khan I in Iran was involved in. So this is called Aga Khan Studs, and it's probably one of the most famous, race breeding operations in the world today. So he's also a person who's very much involved in the world. But if anyone who's paying attention, I would say about 95% of the Aga Khan's work is spent on either the community or the Aga Khan Development Network, and that's simply an empirical fact. I'm pointing this out because it is often a nice polemical tool for people to sort of only focus on the Aga Khan's personal activities. Oh, he owns horses, as if that's the only thing he did, right? But if we put the whole thing into context, this is how it is, and we should not forget that there were many prophets, according to the stories, also were involved in other activities, personal activities. Some prophets were kings. There's hadith. I don't know if they're true, but there are hadith that Prophet Muhammad used to arrange horse races as well in some of the books that Sunnis consider to be sahih. But the point is that the Aga Khan is an Imam. He's also an individual, and he's very much involved in all aspects of human life. And underlying that, at the sort of beneath that, there's this. The Ismailis, of course, they tend to focus on the spiritual nature of the Aga Khan, on his Imamat roles. And that's because underlying all these roles, there is this belief among Shia and among Ismailis in particular that the Aga Khan as the Imam is the bearer of the Muhammadan light, or the Muhammadan reality, a spiritual reality that comes from God and that illuminates the Imam's soul. And 12er Shias believe that their Imams also carry this. But this is the underlying idea in the Ismaili belief in the Imam as the bearer of the Muhammadan light. And in this sense, the Imam is simply a link between the believers and that greater spiritual cosmos that God has created, where reality has much greater fullness than it does in the physical world. Some very quickly then, ritual practices. And the video I show will give you a better idea of some of this. But Ismaili practices today are generally called Tariqah. So this term, Ismaili Tariqah. They're not called Shariah. There are some Shariah practices that Ismailis participate in, but most ibadah, worship practices, are Tariqah practices, which is, of course, what the Sufis refer to the Sufi way. So the whole Ismaili set of ritual practice, for the most part, is on par with what Sufis call the Tariqah or the Sufi way, as opposed to the Shariah. And what are some examples of these practices? Well, Bay'ah is a core practice where an Ismaili gives allegiance to the Imam, and the Imam accepts the person as his murid, as his disciple. So Bay'ah is a sort of spiritual transaction, and that's how you become an Ismaili Muslim. And Bay'ah is required to have access to any other practices. because it's like a contract. The daily prayer that the Ismailis do is called dua, and this is dua with a capital D. So it is a formal prayer. It's in Arabic. It's recited, has 6 parts. Each part contains a Quranic verse in it, such as Surah Fatiha, such as Surah Ikhlas. Each part has a supplication, an attestation of the living Imam, i.e. you name the living Imam and all the parts, and a prostration. It's practiced in private, but in academic literature you could find a translation of the dua if you wanted to. If you did your research, you could basically learn all about this without being an Ismaili. There are also other prayers that they do in addition, which are sort of more locally dependent, so they're in different languages, but they are intercessory prayers. And an intercessory prayer is where one calls upon the Imam as a mediator of God's blessings. And this is very common. Everyone knows, many Shia and some Sunni, they say, Ya Ali Madad. Literally means, Oh Ali, help. That is an intercessory prayer. Ali is being called upon, but he's being called upon because he's believed to be a mediator between God's blessings and the seeker. There are other forms of that prayer. Another prayer is called the Nade Ali prayer, which the Ithnashris would be familiar with. Those are intercessory prayers. Ismailis as zakah, which is today now inclusive of what others called khums. Ismailis give between 10 and 12.5% of their net income to the Imam as their zakah. And this is not charity. Today we translate it as charity, but zakah, even in the Quran, is an offering given to the Prophet Muhammad which results in spiritual purification. And the word zakah actually means purification. So the Ismailis give this offering, but not as charity. It's given as a form of purification. And the Aga Khan, as the Imam, has the sole right to use those funds however he chooses. And when he's been asked about it publicly, he has said that he uses the zakah funds given by the community exclusively for the expenses of the imamat and the community. So that's how he uses it today. There's also devotional poetry. Poetry in South Asian languages, in Arabic, in Persian, in Tajik, and other languages in praise of God, the prophets, and the Imams. In the video I show, you'll hear some of this, so I won't have to explain it. And finally then, the congregational practice of Ismailis today takes place in a prayer space called a Jamatkhana. In the past it took place in other places, but they were also private. And Sufi Tariqah rituals often take place in spaces that are other than the masjid, such as Khanaqah or Zawiya, for example. And even Sufi groups have their own space, also called the Jamatkhana. Chishti Sufis have this. The point is that an Ismaili Jamatkhana is restricted to Ismailis during prayer services. Some Sufi groups follow the same protocol. And it's restricted because those who have not made the contract of bayah, they have not made the commitment required to gain access to those practices. And all those practices that take place in a Jamatkhana, they already presuppose a relationship between the Ismaili murid and the Imam. So if one is not a murid, practices inside a Jamatkhana are really without any context and without any purpose. The Jamatkhanas themselves, they look very different. The one on the right here is in Doshanbe, Tajikistan. The one on the left, this is in Toronto. And across the world, the Jamatkhanas look very different, but they all sort of serve similar functions. They are also social spaces. This is where Ismailis will get married as well. This is where community events will be. This is where book talks and presentations will be. This is where people will just come to hang out sometimes. Prayer happens when men and women are on separate sides. So if you look at this here, like the men will be on one side and the women will be on the other during prayer. But during this, in the social part of the Jamatkhana, which is outside the prayer hall, there is free mixing between men and women. There are no barriers or anything like that. The last thing, and I'll go to the video, The sort of most momentous and revered occasion in the life of an Ismaili Muslim is to see the Imam in a religious context, and that is called a didar. Didar is a Persian term, which means glimpse or vision. This is a picture from a didar. Most of them are private, but they publish photos from them sometimes, and sometimes the didar is in public because there's just so many people. So in this audience here, you probably had non-Ismailis in certain countries. Sunnis and Christians and 12 or Shias, many will come to the Didar. But this is probably the most sort of momentous experience for an Ismaili. So now what I'm going to do now is, I've talked a lot about different concepts and theologies and history and so on, but it would be nice to see how it really looks. So I'm going to play you just 5 minutes from a video where the Aga Khan at the end of 2018 visited Pakistan for the first time in many, many years. And you're going to see in this video I'm just going to play 5 minutes, 4 minutes at the beginning and a minute inside. But you're going to see how he's received. You're going to see samples of the community reciting devotional poetry, how sort of happy they are. You're going to see some partying as well, because the social and the spiritual are not really separate. And you'll see sort of how everybody sort of behaves and receives the Imam when he sort of walks among them for a didar. So that's what I'm going to show, and after that, we can do questions and stuff.
Pakistan calligraphy में भी एक calligraphy गिरमिना स्लो जाका तकरीबन 50 बॉय स्काउट्स और 20 वॉलंटियर्स लगातार साके थप के मूर्डने गिरमिना और गुतेलो तकरीबन 300 ट्रैक्टर सुन ज़्यादा दान भी और इसे टियाटे कम से कम कोई 3 मन चुना इसे टियाटे भी और गुसे टियाटा में तन लाइटिंग है तन के गुते लाइटिंग सिर्फ लाइट शम से में एलईडी इसे लाइट शुड 600 650 का तकरीबन इसे लाइट शुड भी दोनों मन हाइट अटे गुंस टॉलर नियस जुअस और टॉलर फूड प्रोवाइड तस बहुत मुश्किल है जीवन और तकरीबन कोई 20 से 25 दिन तो उसके सिर्फ उसको वर्डिंग गिरमिना सुनने मिला
Tashreef Avri, December 2017 of Maulana Hazrat Imam to Pakistan was a momentous occasion for the Jamaat of Pakistan to commemorate the Diamond Jubilee of our beloved Maulana Hazrat Imam. It has been many years since Maulana Hazrat Imam has been able to meet his murids in Pakistan from the mountainous areas of the north to the coastal areas of the south.
On 7th December 2017, Maulana Hazrat Imam arrived in Islamabad for a historic 13-day visit to Pakistan. A 19-gun salute greeted Maulana Hazar Imam as he disembarked. Pakistan's Foreign Minister, Khwaja Muhammad Asif, welcomed Maulana Hazar Imam and Princess Zara. Leadership from the Jamaat and AKDN were also present to welcome the Imam to Pakistan for this Diamond Jubilee visit. Ismaili Shaheen Scouts and Junior Guides, most seeing the Imam for the first time, added to the atmosphere of excitement.
Now, this is a clip from the Didar that he gives. Okay, so I hope that sort of gives you a sort of a more practical sense of what some of the Ismaili experience looks like. But that's all I have in my presentation. So I hope that was helpful for some of you. But I'm happy to take any questions you have about anything we talked about or anything we did not talk about. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I actually learned a lot. I had a question about the 5 pillars and how that's sort of practiced. You mentioned the daily dua. Is that the same thing as the prayer aspect of 5 pillars, or how does it from Ramadan happen in this sort of thing?
Sure. So I would say generally that for contemporary Ismailis, the idea of 5 pillars is not a notion that is used to articulate religious obligations. The idea of pillars was used in past Ismaili communities, but it was actually 7 pillars, believe it or not. There are other pillars. So one was known as wilaya, which is devotion, obedience to the Imam, and there were other pillars as well. But today, the five-pillar framework is not really used. So it's just the Imam simply does not articulate the obligations that way. The emphasis, so I would say that in the contemporary situation for Nizari Ismailis, the two real core requirements are the daily prayer called dua and giving the zakah. And those are like the most emphasized. And of course, when the Imam gives guidance in a farman and tells you to do something, one is, as an Ismaili, is obliged to follow that guidance. But there is no, one thing is there's no enforcing in the community over whether people actually practice any of this. So no, parents ought to teach their children that, this is our prayer and you should say it, but no one will know if an Ismaili is not giving zakah or not saying his or her dua or anything like that. Now, these other practices like Ramadan fasting, they're certainly seen as part of the tradition. So many Ismailis will fast in Ramadan. Other Ismailis will not fast in Ramadan. And one thing you don't have is the idea that if you don't fast, you are committing a sin. That idea is not there. And there are historical reasons behind this. Ismaili ritual practice is sort of historically has evolved in a very particular way. So when there was a time where the prayer was like namaz that we see today, where Ramadan fasting was strictly observed and all these other things, that was about 1,000 years ago. And there have been theological and historical developments within Ismaili communities. Later imams have given different guidance on how to practice, and all that has led to the situation today, where effectively the Ismaili practice, there are rituals, as you saw, but the framework of these rituals and their form does not really resemble what most Muslims today call the five pillars or Shariah type rituals. I do have another video on YouTube where I explain why this difference is there and how it happened historically to get to this point. Yeah, I hope that was helpful.
I have 2-3 questions. I'm afraid that the answers will be long, but I will do my best to make them short. You said that first. I want to be sure that I understood that right. That you said the Quran are the words of the Prophet, not the direct words of the God. Was it right?
Yes, I said in Ismaili theology, the Quran is seen as divinely inspired words of the Prophet and not the literal or verbal word of God. Because there's this idea that God is so transcendent that God doesn't actually speak in language, basically. So somebody, a human, had to receive God's non-verbal speech and translate that into Arabic or Hebrew or whatever it is. Yes.
And it is believed that the Prophet and the Imams, also the Hazar Imam, has the Isma. I mean, they are free from sin.
Yes. Yeah.